Welcome everybody. Thank you for this chance to talk to you today, which is something of an evolving topic really for myself. I was very privileged to be asked to be the Douglas Haig Fellow for originally 2019, where I probably had the most original excuse to ask to put it back a year in that I was going to Glastonbury. I can't imagine too many Douglas Haig Fellows going to Glastonbury instead of talking. And then, of course, last year, we all know what happened, so it was put forward to this year. And what I wrote, a bit of an original paper for them, was looking at exactly how Douglas Haig evolved as a communicator. And I called it originally Our Chief, where people looked at Haig as a commander and how the meetings with Haig impacted on them directly. Because normally we go to Douglas Haig's diaries and see what he writes in the day. Well, I was then going to people that he met and seeing what they were writing about him. And it became more and more interesting. And I was reminded that Gary Sheffield, when I was doing my master's degree, had a great quote about how he felt that Douglas Haig was as much a battlefield manager as a battlefield commander, which is a very different task, and perhaps the only person in his history that's had to master both. And how did that come about? So what we're going to discuss tonight is we're going to look at exactly when Douglas Haig takes over as Commander-in-Chief, how he evolves in the job to be both a commander and a manager. And one of the advantages, we've got a number of pictures that you wouldn't have seen perhaps before, like the one you see there, which we'll come to at the end exactly how I have these pictures. So where do we start? Well, let's start with some of the opinions of Douglas Haig that are still accessible in written published works and also on the internet from historians. The first one is from Tim Travers, who's a fairly well-known historian, who in 1987 wrote that Haig's personality revolved around an almost obsessive need for order. His structured interior and exterior life, due, it can be argued, to an early developed inner-directed character, meant that he was simply not receptive to basic changes in ideas and lifestyle. And all of these I'm going to challenge over the next hour. Paul Fussell, who again is fairly well regarded, in 1976 wrote, "In a situation demanding the military equivalent of wit and invention, Haig had none." And then perhaps the most damning of all, as recently as 2007 on the internet, an American historian that I don't know, known as Jeffrey Norman, maybe someone else knows him, but he wrote, "Haig was not so much a figure of controversy as one of contempt, a dull, unfeeling, unimaginative, smug Colonel Blimp of the worst sort." That's quite something, isn't it? Imagine that as your annual review. So we're going to have a look at that, and hopefully we will be able to challenge some of those views there. And to do so, I think it's only fair that we go back to 1912. In 1912 was the large field manoeuvre of the British Army trying out new tactics. It took place, as you can see on the map there, in the home counties and through into East Anglia. And there were two corps involved in this, roughly the size of the army that would go to France in 1914. And Douglas Haig was in charge of the Red Forces, and which were based in the south there, while the Blue Forces were going to be under the command of Jimmy Grierson. And it's interesting what occurs in this exercise because Haig is soundly thrashed. In fact, the report says Haig was completely out-generalled by Grierson, in spite of the efforts of the umpires and judges to make the contest appear more even. A major factor, surprising given Haig's view of Haig's interest in aircraft, was that Grierson had an almost perfect knowledge for air spotting of the movements of Haig's troops, whereas he had also hidden his own troops for observation, so Haig never knew where the Blue Forces were. So in 1912, Grierson used aircraft for reconnaissance, which really gave him the advantage over Haig. And what we're going to look at is, did Haig learn from that at all? In fact, Grierson gave a lovely speech, a victory speech, if you like, at Trinity Hall, where he said, "I told them to look as like toadstools as they could and to make noises like oysters." Of course, what occurs just a couple of years later is we do go to war in two corps. And Grierson is in charge of one corps originally, or one of the corps, Haig in charge of the other corps, and poor old Jimmy Grierson, as many of you will be aware, actually dies on his way up towards Mons at Saint-Quentin and is replaced by General Smith-Dorrien. If we pick the story up by September of 1914, and at this stage, number 5 Squadron of the Royal Flying Corps was already attached to Douglas Haig's corps during their fighting on the Marne. He was very, very much aware of the importance of aerial reconnaissance at this stage of the war. It wouldn't have been easy. You know, this is only, a dozen years or so after the Wright brothers, and you can see a squadron in the Royal Flying Corps at this time would be firing a variety of different aircrafts. They've not even got that consistency. But as early as September 1914, the aircrafts attached to Haig's corps were already trialling the use of aerial photography and also wireless with regards to spotting the enemy. And as early as the 9th of September 1914, we can see in Haig's diary, an aeroplane had discovered a large body of enemy on the Marigny-Château-Thierry. I therefore ordered my advance guard to halt and take a position covering the crossings at Charlie and Nogent. So already by September 1914, Haig has remembered what went wrong in 1912, adopted the use of aircraft, and is using them to good effect, and in fact assisting him down on the Marne. So what does he think of some of the men he's got in 1914? Well, here's one that we don't come across too often. This is a chap called Bulfin, General Bulfin. Haig really genuinely rated him in the first months of the war. In fact, he says, I attribute this splendid result to the fine soldierly qualities of Brigadier Bulfin, who had been a tower of strength to Lomax and myself during the retreat and the subsequent fighting. And he says that on the 20th of September. On the 1st of November, Haig mentions him again in his diary by saying, Bulfin has been reported wounded. A great loss to me, as he was a tower of strength all times. So he uses that word, tower of strength, to describe General Bulfin. What does Bulfin say about the same conversation? Not a lot, actually. Man, a few words. We were all very sleepy, but Sir D said many nice things. That's the only reference we've got to it. More cuttingly, and we'll come to this later on in the talk, is out of the blue, at a party in Cairo in July 1918, he describes Haig to one of the guests as, Haig has no more imagination than my boot. So somewhere along the lines that relationship soured, and I suspect I'll be able to point out exactly when that was. Of course, by this stage of the war, General Haig, still a corps commander, was not entirely covered in glory, and the incident that springs to mind immediately was that wonderful drawing there of laundresses, and I'm sure you've been with me before. In fact, I should be there in a few days' time actually again. That is the farm gates where the Coldstream Guards were manning when the Germans appeared out of the Mourmouth Forest. Remember, the corps at the time were told you couldn't make your way through the Mourmouth Forest, it was too thick, so they went around it. The Germans go straight through the middle and almost overtake them. And it's at this point that Smith-Dorrien at Le Cateau on the British left flank and Haig on the British right flank get separated, and are separated right till they get down to the Marne. Haig himself at this stage is suffering from some sort of illness, and we see that from his doctor's notes, and perhaps the whole incident around Landrecies, where he thought he'd be safe for a day, is not a comfortable experience for him. And in the words of the official historian Edmonds, who describes Haig as saying, old DH let down SD that day, which is code obviously for Douglas Haig letting down Smith-Dorrien. It's a lot more complex than that, but you can see there was a lot of feeling about what occurred at Landrecies in the August of 1914. One of Haig's trusted men, if you like, in 1914 was this chap, General Sir Beaver de Lisle. He would go on to become a corps commander in 1918. He had a wonderful mantra in life. A man who excels in sport also excels in war. To me, both are great games, and the greater is war. That's a real Victorian value, isn't it, there as a commander? Well, he was impressed by Haig right from the start, because he writes, General Sir Douglas Haig was responsible for the defence of Ypres and his one corps, which is in 1914. I had known him for many years, and he had gained a high reputation as a staff officer. but his stubborn defence and calm confidence under very difficult circumstances excited my warmest admiration. He has often been criticised for failing to show any strategy beyond that of a slogging match, but as a grim fighter he was unsurpassed. During that terrible, anxious time, with no reserves, against numerically stronger forces, his calmness was amazing, and I knew he was destined for high command. The two are still working together, albeit de Lisle's brief soiree into the Dardanelles by the time he comes back to the Western Front. And certainly in 1918, he's still working with Haig. And this is where we see an interesting little view of each other's personality. Because de Lisle says, and this is 1918 at the Battle of the Lys, perhaps the most worrying time for the BF in the whole of the war, that period of April 1918 on the Lys. The Germans have made many vigorous attacks on this new line without result. They never attacked here again, but tried further north with more success. These Australian troops were very fine. Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig visited my headquarters more than once to express his approval of these enterprises, and as he expressed it, to thank 15 Corps for saving Hazebrouck. So in 1918, de Lisle has a real opinion that his corps has saved the situation, and Haig is really grateful for that. Let's see what Haig says about the same meeting. De Lisle has replaced Duquesne in command of this corps and is very satisfied, as usual, with himself. He took great credit for the position of the 1st Australian Division covering Hazebrouck, which, he said, saved the situation. It is interesting to note that I ordered this division to that position before de Lisle has anything to do with operations in this area. So he clearly doesn't have the same opinion of what went wrong or what went right and why as de Lisle. But as his battlefield commander and his battlefield manager, he appears to restrict these criticisms or views to his diary. He probably did say, well done, because sometimes that's what you do with your staff to encourage them, even if you have your own private views on the inside. And of course, on the 19th of December 1915, which is quite a key date in this, after the Battle of Loos has died down, Haig is actually going to take over as Commander-in-Chief of the BF. And believe me now, his job is going to change significantly, which is the main thrust of this talk, in that he's going to have to manage our forces overseas as much as he's going to be able to, or have to command them. And I think this photograph sums it up perfectly there, where you've got a British general having to entertain the Prime Minister in France with some honoured French guests. Probably the last thing a commander would want to do. Certainly something someone like Wellington wouldn't have wanted to do, or Montgomery wouldn't have wanted to do, but Haig had to do as part of his remit. And as we get to the end of 1915, it's worth noting that Bulfin, the guy that was earlier, we mentioned earlier that Haig appreciated, is now elsewhere. He was in charge of one of the divisions at the end of Loos that was sent out towards the east. And I think Bulfin then saw Haig's career on an upward trajectory, his staying static, and probably never recovered from that, because Haig would have been his commander at Loos, and he would have said, well, you know, why are we getting the blame? No one else. And that probably led him to making that comment in Cairo in 1918, because they hadn't worked together for almost 3 or 4 years. What was the situation that Haig had taken over? Because you've just seen him with the Prime Minister there. Now, there's one thing worse as a soldier than dealing with politicians, and you could argue that's dealing with the press. Okay, so we're going to use this as a precedence. Sir John French, who had Haig's job before him in charge of the BEF, this is what he said about the press. They are the potential enemy within its gates, capable of undermining civilian support by exposing the true nature of modern war. That was a Crimean War reference that Sir John French still believed in by the time we get to 1914. In fact, he would often say to people off the record to avoid newspaper interviews at all costs. He would have off-record discussions, Sir John French, with just a handful of trusted journalists, just a handful of them, only once he'd gained their trust. Actually, one of the things he asked was for Ernest Swinton, whose name you may recall from the innovation of armoured warfare and tanks, and also wrote that wonderful series of books. Was it 20 years after, or the Great War I Was There, or something? Swinton was actually tasked to write a series of eyewitness reports, and the press hated them. They called it journalism light. Why have you got an army officer writing these press reports that aren't actually telling us what's occurring? They're telling us what you want to hear, which didn't add up. But that was all that Sir John French initially offered them. And the national press at the time really were pressing for embedded war correspondence. By the time French is replaced with Sir Douglas Haig in the end of 1915, we can say that he drags the Commander-in-Chief's role from being a cynic when it comes to the press to actually being an active participant in the press and giving them what they want. Haig often refers to what he calls the psychological offensive against the enemy. So he's got a good understanding of how you can use the press to your advantage. And in 1915, of course, there's a number of things that are easy to get the press on side. There's a number of reasons why you can point the finger about you being right and the Germans being wrong, because the idea of propaganda and the use of the press is not only to raise the morale of your own troops, and not only to demoralise the morale of the enemy, but more importantly, to sway the neutral onto your side. For neutral, read the USA. And what happens in 1915? There is unrestricted submarine warfare. There, of course, you'll like this bit, you notice I've put Scarborough before London, just for you today. The bombing of Scarborough from the sea, the bombing of London from the air, and also the use of gas and flamethrowers. So there are a lot of reasons to rally behind the British cause and a lot of reasons to point the finger at Germany at this stage with regards to using the press. The Sunday Times, the week before he took over, said there are spots on every sun and it must be confessed that the new Commander-in-Chief does not like journalists. How wrong they were. Haig changes that very quickly. In fact, he appoints 5 embedded journalists into the BEF and he gives them free rein to go anywhere and write what they would like. The abolition of censorship in the press takes place as early as December 1915. So again, they're free to write as they want, something they weren't under John French. And in 1916, Haig actually met Lord Northcliffe, who says, I was favourably impressed with his desire to do his best to help win the war. He was most anxious not to make a mistake in anything he advocated in his newspapers, and for this he was desirous of seeing what was taking place. I am therefore letting him see everything and talk to anyone he pleases. So here we have Douglas Haig allowing Lord Northcliffe to go where he wants, speak to who he wants, and have free passage around France amongst his forces. That is a massive change from just a year earlier. Stephen Badsey, who has written extensively on this subject, writes that consequently the manner in which Haig fought what is now often called the media war is a neglected factor in assessing Haig's achievements. There is no doubt that Haig certainly knew how to manage the press and their requirements, which no British commander had done so before. However, when we get to 1916, that level of leadership and management is still not across the board, and we find a few quite high-profile critics of Haig's command, 3 of which you see here. The first one is the chap in the eye patch. Probably needs no introduction to many of you. It's Lieutenant Colonel Adrian Carton de Wyatt. He's the only Belgian, I believe, to be awarded a Victoria Cross. You can see on that wonderful painting there of him that he's actually got 3 or 4 wound stripes on his arm. And he wasn't impressed the first time he met Haig at all. In fact, he writes, I had no opportunity of meeting the high and the great ones in my subordinate rank, but while we were training for the Somme, I was introduced to Lord Haig, the Commander-in-Chief of the British Forces. He was a man of striking appearance, but without any charm of manner and no Churchillian gift of words. He mumbled at me, saying that I had given a good example by coming out to France in spite of my disabilities, but the tone of his voice and his unsmiling face made it as uninspiring as if he had said, it is a wet day. He's not alone. Actually, Walter Guinness, also known as Lord Moyne, writes in October 1916, when Monroe was first appointed to go to India, Haig was appointed to command the First Army. The War Council, however, have to ratify army commands and signified it would not be acceptable and that they preferred Wilson, Cavan or Horn in that order. Haig, who has little gift of exposition when presiding over the meetings of generals, appointed number 3, the least brilliant. Cavan, of course, has a great reputation and some people talk of him as the most likely successor to Haig. Of course, we now know that never happened. He did appoint Horn, and he had his reasons for doing so. But at the time, Lord Moyne was not impressed at all. And finally, the last chap who's fairly high profile, who we really can't get an updated view at all of his opinion of Haig, is this chap, Major Billy Congreve, Victoria Cross DSOMC, of course, who dies in the early weeks on the Somme. But he writes quite critically, "I was sent for to see the army commander, who told me he did not consider me fit to command of 5 divisions in common operations. He had been the commander-in-chief who is sending Horn to take over 2 of mine. I had expected something of the sort from the combination of Raleigh and Haig, both of whom consider nothing and no one of use from First Army. It is a severe slap in the face all the same." So he's certainly smarting from the appointments that are being made in and around him. So you're finding even at 1916, at that general officer level, there are some people raising their eyebrows to the way Haig is commanding. But it is starting to change, and here are a few examples. Lord Riddle, another politician. Haig showed himself a big man. He saw he was wrong, and he at once admitted it and acted accordingly. He is a fine fellow. Now, where he changed his mind, which is something that Tim Travers accused him of not being able to do, is of the appointment of a railway construction officer in France to expand the railways quite rapidly. Initially, Haig was a bit suspicious. As soon as he saw it was working, he said, let's do this. Let's have Geddes in charge. Let's do more and more of it. So he directly changed his own views when he saw the evidence was weighing against him. Major Neville Lytton, who of course lives on the Nebworth estate, not far from where I live now, said, "I don't think I shall ever forget the impression of the chief that made upon me. It was the first time I'd ever seen him, and I fell immediately under the spell of his personal magnetism. Haig's qualities were much more moral than intellectual." And that's quite important to remember that, because what we are finding is when he comes up against a pure intellectual, they're the ones that sometimes struggle with him. Anyone, certainly amongst the common man, it appears to be a different opinion entirely. And lastly, the Reverend George Duncan, who was Haig's personal Church of Scotland minister for most of the war, said, "I never met Haig at any time without feeling immensely better for being in his presence. Every time I came face to face with him, I was struck by the genial, kindly look in his eye." And that's the thing we come up time and time again in accounts, is how he had a kindly look in his eyes. Now, one of the chaps that Haig was impressed with as soon as he met him was this chap here, which is William Orpen, the war artist. And on the 11th of May 1917, Haig wrote of Orpen, "Major Orpen, the artist, came to lunch. I told him that every facility would be given for him to study the life and the surrounding of our troops in the field so that he can really paint pictures of lasting value. The War Office had already wanted to see the results of his labours in return for the pay in which he is now receiving. As if he were a sausage machine into which so much meat is put and the handle is turned and out come the sausages. But war is a fickle mistress." A lovely little analogy that is. William Orpen as a sausage machine. And of course that painting is the one that Orpen did himself at General Headquarters in May 1917, just after they first met. Orpen, in his own memoirs, described Haig as Sir Douglas was a strong man, a true northerner, well inside himself, no pose. It seemed it would be impossible to upset him, impossible to make him show any strong feeling, and yet one felt he understood, knew all, and felt all for his men. Never once in all the time I was in France did I hear a Tommy say one word against Haig. Wherever it became my honour to be allowed to visit him, I always left feeling happier." A lovely little thing to say about him, wasn't it? William Orpen. Now, this would have been a typical scene you see on the right here. And when you look at Haig's diary, it's a very, very short entry that says, visited some troops today. All ranks looked fit and healthy. Now the troops that he was visiting on this day were the 2nd Battalion of the West Yorkshire Regiment. You can see them stood too on the side of the road, and you always see the same thing. Haig upon his charger with outriders coming from the 17th Lancers, his personal officer alongside him, and also you then would see the NCO carrying the Union flag on a lance as the symbol that Haig is on his way through. And you're going to see a few different examples of the same image in different parts of France. And the 2nd West Yorkshires he was visiting included this man here, you can see, General Jack. And General Jack talks about the day that Haig visited them. Yesterday, the Commander-in-Chief came to witness our exercise. He arrived at the West Yorks with his aide-de-camp and the orderly carrying a Union Jack at the end of his lance, all perfectly turned out and riding beautifully glossy coated horses. I am introduced to Sir Douglas, who shakes my hand. At this moment 0 hour falls, and seeing that the long kneeling lines of the companies, officers watch in hand, are uncertain as to whether to await inspection or to advance, I canter forward on my polished little warts, that was his pony, to set them in motion with my horn. On my return, the Chief chats affably for a minute or two about the polo we played together in India, and then wishing my battalion good luck, he moves on to another unit. Now this is just that little bit of time spending with the officers to say, how are you? Let's have a look at you and good luck. And also find some common ground, which is something all managers need to do. And in this case, the common ground was the horses and also their shared love of playing polo. Now you'd be forgiven for saying that's the same picture, right? When you look at it, apart from they're Yorkshire and they're not, unless you've changed your headgear at all. But it does show them there the same sort of setup. So it shows you time and time again, almost as if it's rehearsed. Haig had this system, he knew it worked and he would keep to it. And here he is leaning down to speak to a group of Scottish soldiers, or maybe Canadian Scottish, at the side of the road. And the chap you see on the horse to the left there is actually George Black. And George Black was his aide-de-camp for the first 2 years of his command, in fact the first 3 years of his command. And this is what Haig writes when he learns of George Black passing away or being killed in action. I received news of George Black's death yesterday. No details, only that he was badly wounded with his tank and died in the casualty clearing station at Dawes. He was with me from April 1915 until the beginning of this year in charge of the 17th Lancers Troop, who were my mounted escort. He insisted on going to the tank corps as he wanted to fight. He is a great loss to me and all of us, always so cheerful and happy, even when things look darker. And he writes that in August 1918, and of course things had looked very dark indeed, you could argue, from the back end of 1917 through to the end of the spring 1918. Colonel Ryan, who was Haig's medical officer, actually references this. We put a wreath on Black's grave today from Sir Douglas and personal staff. Now the reason I mention that as obviously someone who loves to go to the battlefields as often as I can, and I know many of you like to go to the battlefields as well, well, George Black is buried in Villers-Bretonneux Cemetery. His body's been moved from Dawes where it was originally buried, but he's now in Villers-Bretonneux Cemetery. And I think it's quite strange, next time I go there, since learning this, go and visit him, I think he must be one of the few soldiers buried in one of our cemeteries that can boast that Douglas Haig had a wreath laid on his grave directly from the Commander-in-Chief. That's quite something, isn't it? I wonder how often we walk past his grave, not really noticing the significance of him to certainly the Commander-in-Chief himself. Now, George Black was actually replaced by a chap called Major Ivor Headley and was nervous of taking over that job. So he went to Colonel Ryan, Haig's doctor, when he first took up the post and said, what should I do? What's he like? And Major Ryan's advice to him was quite clear. He's all right if you only treat him as a man and not as a bloody field marshal. So that tells you a lot. You know, if you're a manager and your staff are talking about you like that, you know, treat you as a man and not as a rank. And that shows, I think, a little bit about Haig's character that we perhaps don't see from reading the traditional books. But we should go on to what the troops thought. And now this, my friends, if you've not got a copy, is an absolute must. This was published between the wars by the Evening News, the best 500 Cockney war stories. Now you may have come across it before, controversially, in that there was a book by John Laffin who wrote Tales of the Western Front. And strangely, it was about 500 amusing stories about Australians in France. Word for word taken out of this. So he's deported them all and made them Australians. Now this one we know is quite true, and one of the joys of having a copy of this, it's a paperback so it tends to fall apart, is that at the end of every story that was written in by one of the veterans to the Evening News, they publish his name, his rank and his actual home address, including the house number. So if you're a proper anorak like me, with this book, you can walk around London and the home counties saying, that's where so-and-so lived, he was in the war, you know, real detailed stuff, as we're going to find out. The picture on the left comes from Douglas Haig's wife's book, The Commander-in-Chief as I Knew Him, and that's a cartoon of our man with a series of cheering Tommies as Haig goes past on his charger. And the entrance there, which is really important for us to read, actually one of the kindest, the nicest things I found in doing this bit of research, came from John Hussey, who's a bit of an authority on Haig. This was never for publication. This is Haig's pocket diary that was by the side of his bed that John Hussey came across doing some research. And it says, if one considers how small an amount of success is due to one's individual self, and through what weak instrument God manifests its greatness, it is a simple matter to be modest. The chief credit is due to the gallant troops who knew how to win victory wherever one sends them. And that was his own reminder to himself, not for the public to see. That's quite a different opinion of the man, isn't it, that we don't often see. But what about the guys? What do they write? Sergeant Williams, who was a military medal holder, wrote of him, Dougie knows what he's doing. On 2 occasions I've been cheered up on seeing his quiet, resolute face as he watched us coming out. He was not only our leader and our commander-in-chief, but our friend. It's good feedback that, isn't it, from a soldier? And here we are. This is Private G.E. Morris of the Royal Fusiliers of 368 Iverdale Road, Peckham Rye. Now, that's a proper place in the world there, you see, South East Londoner. And he says, little Ginger was the life and soul of our platoon until he was wounded on the Somme in 1918. As he was carried off to the dressing station, he waved his hand feebly over the side of the stretcher, whispering, don't tell Haig, he'd worry something shocking. So you hope that's a true story as he saw it, that they were all aware of Haig. And there certainly are, if I'd had longer, I came across a series of photographs of Haig visiting soldiers in hospitals. And I don't think they were just a PR exercise. I think it's something he wanted to do. As we move on to 1918, and there again, you can see that picture, different unit this time, on the march, but passing them once again. This is dated the 11th of August 1918, so this is not with George Black, this is with the newer aide-de-camp there, and he's on his way, we know from his movements on the 11th of August 1918, he's actually on his way to Villers-Bretonneux to have a bit of a conference. And again, it's a bit indulgent throwing this in because this is somewhere that you will need to visit next time you're passing to commemorate what is quite an incredible coincidence of this meeting. So Haig on his way, 3 days after the Battle of Amiens. Historians would say to themselves, even today argue, were we from now on pushing against an open door? Are the Germans in full retreat? Are they still defending heavily? It's a meeting he has on the 11th of August that he realises in no uncertain terms there's still a lot of fighting to be done yet. And this all comes from John Monash's book, Victories in France, where he comments there, an accidental meeting together of a number of the most distinguished figures in the war. On August the 11th, the Commander-in-Chief was to come to congratulate the Corps, the Australian Corps that is, and to thank the troops through their commanders. I called all the divisional generals together at the Red Chateau of Villers-Bretonneux to meet him that afternoon. In the meantime, General Rawlinson invited his corps commanders to meet him in the same village for a battle conference, the next phase of what was going to happen. And he chose the same hour and the same spot in the open underneath a sprawling beech tree, where his generals sat informally around and maps were spread upon the grass. You can imagine them all sat there with their maps under this tree in front of the Red Chateau at Villers-Bretonneux. At this meeting were Rawlinson, Curry, Kavanagh, Godley, myself, Montgomery and Budworth. So some pretty high ranking officers there under this tree. The Field Marshal, with Lawrence, his Chief of General Staff, on their way to the Red Chateau, soon arrived at the spot. Shortly after, Sir Henry Wilson happened to be passing in his car, and he also joined the party. And not many moments after they arrived, and entirely again without any previous arrangement, Clemenceau and the French Finance Minister Klotz also arrived. So you had all of these high-profile people all sat under this tree, almost by coincidence. Wouldn't that have been an amazing place to sat in and listened? The more serious business in hand was postponed, while Rawlinson, Curry and I had to listen to the generous felicitations of all these great war leaders. So they all wanted their role. So that got me thinking, does anyone remember the Red Chateau at Villers-Bretonneux from visiting? Because I certainly remember it. It was there until the 1980s, 1990s. So as part of the side effects of the recent pandemic, I had to convert my loft into an office, which meant moving all those boxes of rubbish that we gents like to think are stored, but actually dumped up in the loft. So I went back up into loft amongst all these boxes, and I actually found a photograph of the Red Chateau that I took in the late 1980s. So some of you may remember it now. It used to stand on the side of the road as you came from Amiens into Villers-Bretonneux. And if I'm right, and hopefully I'm not doing too much of an injustice, the chateau stood like that right up until the late 1980s, maybe the early 1990s. And when the village were on their annual holiday, the mayor did an arrangement with Lidl or someone, maybe another supermarket, I don't know, just for the record. And overnight it was destroyed and became a pile of red bricks, never to be returned. What a shocker, isn't it? And so it's no longer there. There's a supermarket there, I think. And I'm using artistic license because that's not a sprawling beach, but it's a sprawling tree. And you could almost imagine there, sat there, couldn't you, underneath it, having that chat. Now, why is that important to this talk? Well, Curry, you can see there on the left with General Haig, spoke to Haig at the time and said, the Germans are not retiring, sir, and the next attack is going to be quite difficult because the topography of the ground we've got to attack over, and I think we need a little bit more time to get ourselves sorted. And Haig said, I don't know if I'm able to press pause button because we're not the only people in this game. The French, the Americans down on the Meuse are gone. Everyone is pushing forward or planning to push forward, or, you know, certainly Sam Miel's in the planning at this stage. So I'll see what I can do, but can you give me the evidence? That was on, remember, the 11th of August. On the 14th, Haig writes, he, Rawlinson, showed me a letter which he'd received from General Curry stating that to capture the position in question would be a very costly manner. He, Curry, was opposed to attempting it, and I accordingly ordered the date of this attack to be postponed. So under that sprawling breech tree, as a result of meeting Curry and Rawlinson, Haig changes his mind or delays an attack on the advance of someone, one of his subordinates who've got the most latest up-to-date intelligence. I would say that's another example where, unlike Tim Travers saying, you know, he's not for change, here's another example of when he does it on the ground and probably saves how many lives by not attacking as quickly as was originally planned. So we've done with the Canadians. Now let's have a look at the Australians, and certainly at the time around the Hindenburg line. This is John Monash, as you'll all recognise there. And Haig says on the 26th of September 1918, so just 3 days before the attempt to break the Hindenburg line, I visited Australian and 2 American corps in Hupmets off of the Barlow-Assavillas Road. General Monash had 40 or 50 officers gathered together for a conference. Monash begged me to go in and see them all, even at the risk of delaying matters. So I went into the room, I shook the senior officers by the hand, and I said a few words of encouragement. I told them that the biggest battle of the war had started this morning, 26th of September 1918. Bonus point. Anyone could tell me what battle that was? Does anyone know? He's being clever here, Haig. He's cleverer than us because he's speaking to American commanders. It's the opening day of Meuse-Argonne offensive. So even though he's got Americans under his ranks, he can see they're nervous about what they're about to do, and he's saying, you know, the biggest battle started today, and it's your country that's starting it. And we can't argue with that. Meuse-Argonne remains the largest American army offensive in history, bigger than anything they did in the Second World War. General O'Ryan was one of the American commanders there. He was in charge of 27th New York Division. And he says, toward the conclusion of the conference, Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Forces, dropped in and addressed to the assembled officers a few words of confidence in the outcome. Monash has a different view of the day. He says, while the conference was in full swing, the Field Marshal himself paid a call. He had come to wish me success in the task before me. He was interested to find so many divisional commanders assembled and was persuaded to address a few words to the gathering. The conduct of the proceedings of this conference was a heavy strain. So there's no doubt that Monash was really feeling the heat in September 1918, partly due to battle fatigue, not only from his troops but also from himself. They'd been at it, the Australian Corps, from April the 25th right through to September, and they're still in the line. In fact, Haig left that meeting and thought, I'm not entirely happy with that. I think I'm going to go back and see Monash again and see if I can help. As you can see, on the 28th, he returned to the Australian headquarters there, and you can see him here inspecting some Australian troops. At 3 p.m, I visited the Australian Corps and I found Monash in what he called a state of despair. I told him that both reports may be correct. In any case, it was not a serious matter and he should attack tomorrow morning in force as arranged. So quite assertive, almost, get your heels together, it's going to be okay, just go ahead. And what were the two reports? Well, the two reports were, when the Australians and the Americans planned to break the Hindenburg line, the first thing they discover is that their start line to the north is not in Allied hands. The Germans are still holding it. The British troops in and around Epie to the north had not captured the start line. So the first thing he has to do is send in the inexperienced Americans to capture their own start line before they can start the offensive. Doesn't go so well. Some of them have captured bits of it, some of them haven't. Lots of them will wander around no man's land in front of them, not knowing where they've gone. Consequences mean Monash is not going to be able to use artillery, which is the dominant weapon at this stage of the war. The biggest part of his train set. He's not able to use it because no one is going to shell no man's land when your own troops are in there. So it means when the Americans and the Australians do go over the top, they go over into a state of confusion. But Haig's got to remember, as a manager, that's only one small part of a large line. And because that small cog's not working, you've still got to keep the rest of the stuff going forward. John Monash also says, the Commander-in-Chief, Field Marshal Haig, was a frequent caller and never departed without leaving a stimulating impression of his placid, hopeful and undaunted personality, nor without generous recognition of the work in which the Corps was doing. So he went in as a state of despair. After Haig had spoken to him, he left him in slightly calmer state, thinking, okay, the man himself has told me it'll be all right, it should be all right. But Haig just didn't go back to his chateau. Of course, he didn't live in a chateau at this stage of the war. He was living on a railway train, so he could get his headquarters on the train up and down to the generals as and when they needed him. And before leaving, he decided to go and see this stuff. And I've put that up there because that is the Hindenburg line. Now, we're not looking at one part of trenches. In fact, that's just the centre part. In parts, this was like 8 to 10 kilometres deep, and all of those dark lines are barbed wire. This isn't something that your Fortnum and Mason wire cutters are going to get you through. You need heavy armour, heavy artillery to either pull the wire apart or smash it up with artillery before you come against anti-tank guns, hidden artillery emplacements, machine gun posts, and then you get into the series of trenches, all of which was going to fall onto the plate of this chap here, George Wendell Reed, who is the American Corps commander for this operation that has been loaned to the Australians for the event. So Haig goes to visit him. I went into the American 2nd Corps HQ, which is close to the Australian headquarters, as the latter are now nursing the 2 American divisions. And I saw General Reed, who is a good, honest fellow, but all this class of warfare is quite new to him, and he was genuinely very anxious. I did my best to cheer him up and told him the reality was much simpler than the imagination pictured it to his mind. So again, some calming words. Now, those calming words are important because if you look at the Army Leadership Code at Sandhurst today, 2 of the 5 points are encourage confidence in the team and recognise individual strengths and weaknesses. So we can see this is something that Haig is doing as far back as the First World War. And of course, what we're not taking into consideration here is the pressure Haig is under in September 1918. He has shortly before this operation received what was known as quite an infamous telegram from Wilson, which is pretty much saying to him, if you get this wrong, mate, you're going to get the sack. And in fact, Haig mentions on the 1st of September, I can attack the Hindenburg line if I think it is right to do so. The Chief of the Imperial General Staff and the Cabinet already know that my arrangements are being made, and to that end, if I am successful, I will remain on as Commander-in-Chief. If we fail, or our losses are excessive, I can hope for no mercy. So he's under a lot of pressure from London at this time to be very careful, but he decides not to show that fear to those that are serving under him. So how did Haig get on with the Americans generally? Or important, how did Haig get on with Pershing? Now you'd think they might not have anything in common. Haig comes from quite a well-to-do family. He's a Scottish lowlander, isn't he? He's had a good education and comes from relative wealth. Whereas Pershing has really made his own luck. Son of I think it's an Iowan or Idaho farmer, and very, very sort of abrupt, will tell you how he feels. Probably not unlike Haig. When they first meet in 1917, July 17, Haig says this, I had a talk with General Pershing before and also after dinner. I was much struck by his quiet, gentlemanly bearing, so unusual for an American. Most anxious to learn and fully realises the greatness of the task before him. Now these two would clash over a number of issues through the war, but it's okay to clash, provided you don't fall out. You can have different opinions, that's what life's about. And quite often, as part of a coalition, remember, coalition commanders, you are trying to all achieve the same thing, each of you for very different reasons, and as we get towards the end game, all scrambling so that your country gets the best position as we leave. And we see this a lot with Pershing and Haig. They do squabble certainly over where troops go and how they're trained and who's going to do what. However, they don't fall out. And Pershing writes in 1928, we became very warm friends during the World War, and I have the most pleasant recollections of our service together. He was ready at all times to aid in the training of our troops, and his counsel and advice were most valuable. He was always fair-minded, frank and sincere. No officer ever served his country's cause with deeper devotion. As Commander-in-Chief of the British armies, he was an outstanding figure in the World War and will go down in history as one of Britain's greatest commanders. You wouldn't say that about someone you didn't really get on with. Some of the intellectuals are now starting to also talk about Haig's decision making. Now, if you look at that photo of Haig there, it's the one I find that comes from sort of October 1918, where he looks most stressed and least dynamic. He almost looks like he's now starting to carry the pressure of that command for so long in the war. And he himself is not to know exactly how quickly that war will come to an end. The chap there is a guy called Hugh Wansey Bailey. Now, I don't expect you to have read this quote before, because he wrote a book called something like Shells and Whirligigs. It's a very rare memoir. It's one of those ones I picked up in a bookshop. He's a medical officer, and I scoured through it for quotes for Haig, and he says, it must have taken great courage for Haig to give the order that for our armies against the Hindenburg line, whose system of defence was as strong as human ingenuity of a high military order could make it. Some writers say that this momentous and victorious decision was Haig's alone, and that Foch felt he could not be responsible for ordering such an attack. It must have been a gamble, for if the defenders of the Hindenburg line had have been of good fighting spirit, the positions could not have been taken without appalling losses, such a loss as the country would probably have deeply resented. Haig certainly exhibited a strong moral courage. So they're starting to admire him for the decision making. Lord Riddle, the guy we heard of earlier, he makes a comment in the same month. Haig is here, London that is, for consultation. Lloyd George thinks he looks worn and is anxious for peace. It seems that Haig advised Lloyd George to make peace some time ago. Haig thinks there is a lot of fight still left in the Germans. Lloyd George says, if the Commander-in-Chief is tired out, what must the army be? So behind the scenes, it gives you an indication of the chat. Well, as we know, they do hold it out. When Haig is told that the war might go on for another year, in fact it's Churchill that writes it could go on to 1920, Haig says, what rubbish, who will last till 1920? Only America? That's the only line I can find of where he's starting to doubt his own and his country's ability to stay in the war. But thankfully, as we know, they do stay in the war. And this photograph taken not far from the Hotel Beatus, you know, where Philippe Kozinski has in Cambrai, just as you head in towards the town. It's one of the little chateaux there on the left. Is Haig on Armistice Day with all of his generals and staff on a day commemorating the armistice. And you would be, excused for thinking the first thing they do is hit the champagne, right, after all that time. Not so. In fact, there is a little bit of fun and games where Lord Plumer, you can see him on the left there, looking the most general-like of all the generals, and certainly one of the oldest there. When someone comes up to film them in what they call the kinema, they push Plumer forward to get kinemacraft and say, go on, you go in front of the cameras, and while he's being filmed, they're all taking the mickey out of him. So just like men, even when they're field marshals and generals, they're still children underneath. But Haig actually writes about the 11th of November. I think this is wonderful. I then pointed out the importance of looking after the troops during the period following the cessation of hostilities. Very often the best fighters are the most difficult to deal with in periods of quiet. I suggested a number of ways in which the men could be kept occupied. It is as much the duty of all officers to keep their men amused as it is to train them for war. If funds are wanted, GHQ should be informed, and I'll arrange for the money to be found. On the Armistice Day, Haig's primary concern was for the welfare and the care of his men and getting them the kit they needed, whether that's boxing gloves, football boots, rugby balls, whatever they need, cricket wickets, just to keep them entertained, because now the fighting is over, keep them busy. I think that's quite incredible. Of course, it is time eventually for Haig to leave, and this is where you're going to see a series of photographs that you may not have seen very often before. I might have used them on a couple of online lectures, but my wife works frontline NHS, and she has done all her life. And we had a little agreement when we were a lot younger. We met at school. As you know, we were both sort of 15. And I came back from soldiering. Ali was working in operating theatres. We had a little agreement there in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, that when she had clients in of a certain age, check their date of birth. If it was between 1895 and 1900, see if you can just slip them a card so I can meet them at some stage, because they might be First World War veterans. And this actually turned up a few trumps, and one of the trumps was a chap who lived in Hill Hempstead, who was an army photographer, who I went round to see, and he said, well, I didn't do much really, I took a few photographs. He said, well, I've got some you might be interested in. I've got no one to give them to. It was when Haig left Boulogne, I took a load of photographs with him, and because these have got slight blurs in, they were no use. Would you like them? So I've got this lovely little pack of photographs, about a dozen or so, but we'll flick through some of them. This is the Haig staff saying goodbye to him at the port side as he returns to England for the last time. John Jack references that before departing, Douglas Haig simply said, "Thank you, gentlemen," and then passed from us a redoubtable, well-liked chief who for nearly 4 years had calmly borne a crushing load of responsibility. And these are the two photographs I really like in here, so it's a little bit more of light relief for you. This is Boulogne Railway Station. It's still recognised this today. You can see down here are all the posh people waiting for the parade. Here's the British Guard of Honour. There's the British band there with the sergeant bandmaster and the sergeant major and what have you. Here's the Poilus band. There's the liaison officer. Navy, who are going to take control of this now because he's about to get on a boat or a ship. Here's the French Guard of Honour. You can see them. Look, you'll be here in a minute. You can imagine the scene, can't you? What's always intrigued me, being a signaller, cap on the back of my head, hands in my pockets, is this guy here. See, he's completely out of context with the people around him. It's not long before he's going to be told to clear off. And also, look at these guys here. These are waiting to go home on leave. These poor lads here can't see anything because of all the tall blokes in front. So I think I've put a ring round them for you. You can see a ring round that signaller, and then a ring round them stood there. And then we've got the next shot, which is taken just a few seconds later. And there you can see General Haig as he marches his way up. He's gone. My man's been moved on. In fact, you can see that bloke's turn around and say, where's he gone? So he's obviously scarpered. And more importantly, these lads, for someone, if you think they wouldn't care about Haig, they're actually stretching up to get a view of him. where they couldn't see before. They're climbing up. What a wonderful image that is. And that's him on his way to making his way home. Now, he does get on board the boat, as you can see. We could have a caption competition here for what these two are saying. I recognise that fella. What's he doing? You know, or you go and tell him, not me, I think is more likely what he's saying. You go and tell him, not me. Because what we have here is absolute evidence of Haig breaking the law from time to times. I know there's that famous photograph of him sat at his desk with his pocket not done up, and everyone says, oh, he wouldn't have allowed his men to look like that. Well, here we see another example of him being a bit of a scallywag. Firstly, well, his wife's come over. This is Dorothy, isn't it? It's come over to make sure he's clean, changed his underpants or whatever on the boat to go home. But this is what I like most of all, is passengers are not allowed onto the navigation bridge. Yet there he is on there and he's a passenger. So guilty, 7 days restrictions of privileges I'd have given him if I'd have caught him doing that, which is probably why those sailors aren't going up to him. Haig eventually does get home, and here we see a picture of him with one of my other great heroes, Roger Keyes, Gallipoli man. I can't do a talk without mentioning Gallipoli, can I, of course, my spiritual home. And he talks about Haig here. When he gets back to London, the route was not lined with troops. The reception was essentially a welcome by the people without any official interference. And I could not help feeling how the cheering from great masses of all classes came from their hearts. As aide-de-camp to King Edward, I had taken part in many functions, but never before had I seen such crowds or such wholehearted enthusiasm. And that's on his way back from Dover up to London, where people took to the streets to turn out and see him. Eventually, he goes a few months later up to Scotland, where he meets with Roger Keyes. You can see in the photograph here. And Roger Keyes mentions in his memoirs, whilst I was at Rosyth, Sir Douglas Haig passed through on his way to Aberdeen. He had been made an LL&D of the university, an honour which was also to be conferred upon me, so we went there together. The undergraduates gave us a very warm, though rather a boisterous welcome. Directly after the ceremony in the university, a number of young soldiers seized Sir Douglas Haig, and some sailors, mainly RMVR doctors, seized me, and they carried us through the streets to the City Hall, where we were to be lunched. That wonderful sight. You can imagine them head and shoulders. Now, just 10 years after this took place, of course, there's going to be another outpouring of recognition of Douglas Haig, and that's when he passes away. And you can just see from this one, and if you go onto the internet on YouTube, actually, they've got film of his funeral. There's one clip in particular where you can see his horse with the boots in reverse in the stirrups riding forward. And you can see there on the gun carriage as he's being taken across Westminster Bridge there. And in the background, you can see, of course, the Houses of Parliament and what have you. And the streets were lined all the way across London at this time. And what had Haig done in those last 10 years between the war? What was he most famous for? Well, really, I suspect it would be the fact that him and Ian Hamilton, of course, another of Gallipoli fame, actually, at a time when the whole of the world was politically kind of manifesting itself into either sort of Marxists and revolutionaries or traditionalists and more conservatives that we see ends up in the general strike and this sort of thing, veterans associations were bickering. You know, you have the Order of the Tin Hat or Moth or whatever it was, which was really for fairly right-leaning soldiers. And then you had other veterans associations that were really left-leaning. And Haig and Ian Hamilton between them were really the two principal men that turned round and said, look, this isn't about politics, this is about being veterans. And it's from there that we see the formation or creation of the Royal British Legion as we see it now, you know, unifying in those veterans. And so right up until 1928, he was spending his time looking after the welfare of his men. In fact, one of his last public appearances was to go to Welwyn Garden City, a new sort of garden city that was emerging just outside of London, to take part in what the Daily Mail referred to as the Ideal Home exhibition, which you'll still recognise. I think they still sponsor it today. But this is where they got a load of architects to design houses for veterans or houses for the future. And I think it's very telling that Haig was the man that judged all of those houses. And first prize went to the architects of the disabled ex-officers of the 18th Eastern Division. So even that, the competition, he awarded it to some of his veterans. And so a number of the houses in Welwyn Garden City today are based on the design of men of the First World War. So he was always caring about them. And he was always going to be immortalised in bronze, in these wonderful statues like the one we see here at Whitehall. And to go with this, I found a reference by a young soldier from 1918. Well, a young soldier, Major Herbert Asquith's Prime Minister's son. Major Asquith, who wrote in his book Moments of Memory. Just look at that image and then listen to the words. This is 1918. A few days before we went up to our new positions, Haig came to review our division, which was drawn up in a line in the valley. The guns and their teams were in close order on the right, the infantry on the left, making rather a grim array as they looked to their front beneath the brims of their steel helmets. On the crest of a small hill, Haig suddenly rode into view on his charger and halted for a short time on the skyline to acknowledge our salute. He might almost have been mistaken for a figure of bronze as he sat motionless on his horse, outlined against a grey, wintry cloud, looking down on this division that had fought in so many of his battles. Is that a wonderful description of him as a statue while still alive? Of course, that's the statue we've got. Many of you that have been down to Rusey or Whitehall would have passed it and seen it from time to time. It was put up in the 1930s, 1937 to be precise. And one of the people that went to the unveiling ceremony was General Birdwood. And he writes of the statue, in November of that year, the Duke directed me to represent him at the unveiling of Haig's statue in Whitehall. It is, I think, a good likeness of my old chief and friend, whose stature continues to grow, or whose stature grows and will continue to grow in public estimation as the years go by. But no cavalryman will think well of the quadruped on which he is mounted. Haig would certainly never have ridden it. He was a good horseman. So the criticism is of the artistic Grecian-style horse as opposed to the man. And it's only when that was pointed out to me, I looked at it and thought, actually, it does look like someone's plonked a classical statue on a modernist horse, doesn't it? They don't quite go together. But the key thing there is even Birdwood refers to him as my old chief and my friend. So here is Haig with a number of his staff officers again at his little headquarters out in France, far from a chateau if you've ever visited it. And this is what Professor Gary Sheffield said that got me sort of thinking about this. He was a war manager as much as anything else, managing this vast army, helping it to train, to equip, as well as being a general on the battlefield. He was taking on so many jobs. When you read his diary, 1 minute he's looking at a quarry where they're making stones to put down on the road surface. The next minute he's looking at the latest advances in tank warfare. The next minute he's visiting a veterinary hospital, and the next minute he's speaking to his generals, and the next minute then he's dealing with press and everyone else. It's a full-on task. And an example of that, if we go to May 1917, so we come to conclusion, is Haig visited 8 corps commanders in May 1918, 23 divisional commanders, and in his diaries record the names of 68 separate officers that he met. During that same month, he also entertained Lloyd George, Petain, King Albert of Belgium, and he had conferences with General Plumer, General Gough and General Allenby. That's a lot of things to put in your calendar, as well as commanding the British Expeditionary Force in the field. So, in conclusion then, firstly, if we look at the Land Operations Manual, which the Army uses today, 1917, the most up-to-date one I could get hold of, it says, it is also the role of commanders to create and foster an effective command climate by the nature of their personality, their leadership, their command style and their general behaviour. Commanders have an enormous influence on the morale, the sense of direction and the performances of their staff, subordinate commanders and soldiers. And I would conclude that just as the BEF developed into an efficient fighting force between 1916 and 1918, so Douglas Haig also developed his personality and command style to foster an effective command climate that both encouraged and benefited those who served under him. In fact, during the period of the Great War, I'd say that he proved himself both the BEF's manager and their commander, and I think that's a role rarely, if ever, is undertaken by an individual person, either before Haig's time or certainly since. So thank you, and I'll take any questions.
Mademoiselle armistice, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from armistice, she hasn't been kissed for 40 years. Hinky, pinky, parlez-vous. Out on kicking armistice, parlez-vous. Out on kicking armistice, parlez-vous. Out on kicking armistice, broke the spell of 40 years. Hinky, pinky, parlez-vous. The officers get